This lecture concludes the series in the Dutch Republic, looking at the end of the century with the artists Terborch, Vermeer, and Ruisdael, and the rise of genre scene painting and landscapes in this region. According to André Philibert, with his hierarchy of genres established in 1667, history painting was seen as the most sought after and respected genre of painting. Moving down, as we discussed, you have less prestige with less figures, and certainly less so if we're not basing the work on a classical or historical scene. So the knowledge of human anatomy and of the scholarly pursuits necessary to understand the stories were central for painting in Italy and France especially. However, in the northern countries of the Dutch Republic, we have new genres that are developed, such as genre scenes and landscapes. The term genre scene, in fact, was used first in France. The Dutch did not use the term for scenes of everyday life that often have moralizing overtones. Instead, they listed the specific titles of what is being represented, such as two smokers or a bagpipe player. Now, what is interesting about genre scenes, even though in the popular mind and in history of art surveys, that they are often represented as being dominant and popular in the northern countries, they in fact were not the most popular genre in the Republic, representing less than 4% of the works in 1610 and only 10% of the market share by the end of the century. History painting as well would decline from 46% to 14% by the 1680s. Notably, the demand for church decorations, altarpieces, etc., is going to decline in a region dominated by Calvinists and Protestants. The most popular genre, interestingly enough, by far, would be landscapes, rising from 23% at the outset of the 17th century to 39% by the 1680s. This genre will come to dominate the art world and is central to the subjects in modern art. So still lives are still going to be popular at this time, especially at the outset of the century, and do not, again, contradict the religious beliefs of these northern Calvinists. An example of this would be Pieter Clouts's Vanitas still life of 1630, where we find inanimate objects are going to be the primary focus with a nondescript background, seated on a table with a candle once again extinguished, a glass overturned, a key, a once again tome with books, a pen and inkwell with a skull. So this is common throughout Europe, but this approach is distinctly Dutch. For if we compare this type of vanitas to the one we looked at with Juan de Valdez Leal, we find that there are no additional religious symbols here or iconographic conventions, such as the name of Christ or a bishop's mitre. Instead, we have, once again, elements that are very common and accepted relating to death. The skull, the tomes or the books on which the skull sits, the watch in a gold case, the empty overturned glass, and the oil lamp with an extinguished flame, all of which are going to point to mortality and death, which even the strictest Calvinist would have no qualms with, because we are not in an idolatrous fashion showing any religious figures. We are merely reminding in a secular fashion the viewer that they will die with this memento mori. Now, Jan Steen here, with his skittle players outside an inn of 1660 to 63, illustrates that genre scenes are not conceived of as an historical record of what was actually transpiring in the Dutch Republic. Instead, they are going to often reinforce moralizing themes and those associated with the 7 deadly sins. So we cannot use these paintings as an illustration of what actually occurred and what life would look like, but instead must see it through the lens, taking into account these contextual information, such as the moral instructions, warning against gluttony, sloth, lust, and so forth. Here we have a game which is very popular in the north called skittle that is still practiced in Holland today, where much like in bowling, you try to knock over pins. So before, 1640, we depict primarily in genre scenes low or high life characters. In this example, death visits this couple absorbed in transitory delights, unaware that they will soon die and everything that they have will be lost to time. Down below, we even have a moralizing inscription in Dutch, warning against luxuries, warning against avarice or greed. While this was common at the outset of the century, artists like Judith Leister would bring in middle-class subjects. So born in Haarlem, we know that Leister knew Frans Hals and even sues him when Hals attempts to take one of her students. Leister won the lawsuit. Now, she is going to stop painting after her marriage to another painter to avoid competing and competition within the household. She introduces, importantly, domestic subjects. Thus, the middle class is shown with female protagonists, which are new. Here in the proposition of 1629, we have a reinterpretation of the theme of prostitution, where a woman works diligently by candlelight, sewing here with a foot warmer underneath her dress, while a man in a fur hat leans over, trying to get her attention by tapping her on the shoulder, holding coins out with his right hand. She ignores the proposition. This is the same theme as earlier examples like the Procuress by Dirk van Baburen, where we find that a scantily clad woman playing the lute is going to be receiving money that a procuress here or a madam is going to demand, while the John or client has his hands around her shoulder. So we find that, on the other hand, Leister's example with the proposition, we see the woman is not dressed provocatively and does not respond to the exchange of sex for money. So the moral manuals of the day are going to inform women that they should occupy themselves in idle moments and ensure that they do not fall into or prey to one of the 7 deadly sins, such as lust or greed especially. Now, the foot warmer is very important in the North, for it is symbolizing one's relationship status as either single or available. So the foot warmer here is under the dress, therefore she is married or engaged. If it was halfway out, the suitor would have a chance, whereas if it is empty on a floor behind the woman, she has no companionship and is available. So genre painting after 1640 starts to introduce middle and high class subjects, replacing these lower class representations previously by Peter Bruegel the Elder, who painted peasants, for instance. Even the soldiers in these examples are better dressed, and intimate domestic subjects become quite common. Thanks to the Treaty of Munster of 1648, when we have peace in the Republic and the official recognition by Spain of the Dutch Republic as its own nation, we turn away from military themes to those relating to the pleasures of a well-run home. Thus, the sphere of domestic responsibilities are now legitimized as something that should be focused on. And so we find that genre scenes also begin reflecting this new trend. The same themes do continue, but now more ambiguous with the theme here, such as illicit love, where the provocative understanding of purchasing a woman in prostitution is going to be quite ambiguous. For the moral lessons are shown here with the veneer of upper-class elegance thanks to Louis XIV and the adoption of French manners in the Dutch Republic. Here we have a soldier who is going to be holding a coin up to a woman whose expression we cannot see, while either the mother or a procuress drinks wine and does not react to the scene. We know that of the 7 deadly sins, the visiting soldiers often represent greed and lust, tempting women with this proposition. So the interpretation here is left purposefully vague by Gerard Terborch. We note that, is this a proposal for marriage or prostitution? We are not sure because she is framed by the bed, and we do not see her reaction, but we know it has something to do with a bed. Now, the proposal, whereby you would frame a woman, what is in the background, quite commonly since the 15th century, would relate one's role in life, either in the domestic sphere of life or the public sphere. We can see in other paintings the same framing of a woman who's dressing, for instance, or undressing. So this goes back to Jan van Eyck, where we note that Giovanni Arnolfini and his bride Gianna Cinami are also going to be framed by their respective spheres of influence. She by a bed and domesticity, and he by a window and an open door, thus the public sphere of life. So the same scene, arguably, is going to be here with the procuress, as with the parental admonition. However, we do not have the same type of clear-cut interpretation, for we do not see her reaction. She could be ignoring, as in Leicester's example of the proposition, the advance by this man. But we do not know. The ambiguity is going to be left to the viewer to interpret, for we have an old woman here. Is she, once again, the mother or a procuress? We do not know. We also do not see the reaction of the woman. What we do know about Terborch, however, is that he is unrivaled in his ability to depict satin, which is often discussed as a metaphor for the skin of a woman. Thus, we can possibly understand here that we're not showing nude figures that would violate the propriety and the decorum of Northern Calvinists, but we can still show something that is eroticism subverted. We still are relating in this way a woman's soft skin, for instance. This is another example in several of these paintings by Terborch where people would commission from him these small domestic interiors of a view of a woman from the back with this silver satin dress. Turning to Ruisdael, we have the young mother of 1660 and an ideal model for female behavior, which we often see these genre scenes reinforce. Here we have a very elegant upper-class interior with velvet, luxurious materials and a chandelier, obviously out of reach of most middle-class homes. Now we know that Douw studies with Rembrandt, thus the fall of light comes from Rembrandt's studio and approach. But the meticulous finish here is inspired for the term Feinschilder that we've been using, or a fine painter. Thus the details of the tapestries, the wooden ornamentation, the velvet cloth, all of which are going to relate to a very careful appreciation of textural differentiation. Now, the image of a woman breastfeeding her child was before only seen in religious images of the Madonna del Latte, or the Madonna of the Milk, who breastfeeds the Christ child. So now we turn this rather mundane activity that one would see on a daily basis in a domestic home into something that is iconic and that women should strive to be like the Virgin Mary, the mother to us all. So in financial terms, we should note that Ruisdael is in fact the most successful painter in the Republic and is incredibly successful with this approach to genre scenes of these upper class interiors and finely painted, licked clean surfaces. Now the foot warmer, interestingly enough, is under her skirt. Thus we know that the lady of the house is taken and married. But Douw moves this further along and uses it to raise her leg for better supporting breastfeeding. Therefore, we can see how it is going to be integrated into the activity that one would see in a domestic sphere. Turning to Pierre de Hoek, we find that here with the mother of 1660, we have a more believable middle-class interior that is strictly controlled by way of geometry. So here we have a mother unlacing her bodice to breastfeed the child in the bassinet to the lower left, whereas a young girl looks out of the door onto the outside world. The dog is going to be motioning to the man's red cloak, showing that the husband is absent in this way. So compared to Gerrit Dou and his young mother of the same scene and subject, we find that De Hoek is going to show us a truly middle-class interior with believable nursing. So this very clean, neat, and orderly home, calibrated by geometry, is going to relate to the Dutch interest in how important home is and cleanliness of the home as it relates to one's moral standing, not only in society, but as far as the domestic sphere is concerned. However, the domestic sphere is not always used in genre scenes to showcase ideal behavior. With Nicholas Mies here, with The Idle Servant of 1655, we also showcase what behavior to avoid. So we know that Mies is going to study with Rembrandt and is going to represent good housewives, as you see here to the left, but also the vices associated with domesticity. So in the back, we see that in the main room, the guests are going to be chatting while the lady of the house, the mistress, fetches more drinks for these visitors. And she finds in the pantry, in the kitchen, the maid asleep with the scattered dishes that should be washed at this point around the floor. So this is going to be representing one of the 7 deadly sins, specifically sloth, for she is being slothful. The reason for her idle nature is shown with the cat who takes the chicken behind him, which of course is going to be a proverb and a saying, that being the cat takes the chicken. Thus someone was seduced, explaining her condition after a very late night of illicit behavior. So the scene here is going to be a warning against what you should avoid, what we should, once again, be looking to not model our behavior on. We should be chaste and moral. We should not be licentious in this way. The encounter of a woman eavesdropping or servants that are behaving badly is going to be seen in several examples by Mace, such as the eavesdropper with a scolding woman. That being idle gossip and eavesdropping was seen also as one of these sins. All of these genre scenes, importantly relating to female domesticity, are going to represent the interest, rather the obsession that the Dutch have with being a good mother and a good wife. And this comes from a very important manual for women, Jacob Catz's The Good Housewife, published first in 1625, outlining what women should do to be good wives and mothers, including keeping the home clean and tidy and free of filth and dirt, to once again being a good wife to her husband, to ensuring that the children are cared for, etc. So this is going to be a common book that all Dutch women have and that Dutch men are familiar with and for which their wives are measured against. So the series of women sleeping, as well like the one just seen, is also in the St. Louis Art Museum with the old woman dozing and the account keeper, where we find that we're implying sloth, where these women are not going to be active, but it's shown as preferable to avarice or greed, as they're going to play a role in the family business checking the finances. Turning our attention to the city of Delft, which is just southeast of The Hague, we have the home of a painter that is famously known for his genre scenes. Johannes Vermeer is going to be a very enigmatic painter, for we know very little about him. For instance, we don't know who he trained with or who he received instruction from. His approach is restrained and introspective, and his genre scenes often have much less narrative content and social comment that is overt, as in the last examples we just showed you, such as the ideal behavior of women in domestic settings. He has instead dense subliminal content, whereby the ambiguity with which he presents his scenes are going to ask the viewer to complete the interpretation themselves. Now, he works very slowly. He has 36 works to his oeuvre in total, and produces only 2 or 3 of these a year. He does marry Catharina Bolnes and converts to her religion Roman Catholicism, which is not uncommon, as we also looked at other artists from Flanders who do the same. When he died, he left his wife and 11 children with heavy debts. Luckily, we are going to find that they do attempt to sell off many of his paintings or keep them for sentimental value. Now, his early work, like the Procuress of 1656, a common and very popular subject of a tavern, whereby we have a prostitute, a client, and a procuress, that being a madam, including a self-portrait of Jan Vermeer himself, is going to be relatively frank and straightforward, with clear chiaroscuro patterns and textures. In this example, we have large figures, and we know that he had ambitions to become a history painter, but found that genre scenes were much more lucrative, and he is certainly correct, looking at the success of Dao. So in these examples, we have a straightforward way in which scenes are going to be presented. The man here is going to flip a coin into the woman's right hand. He has his left hand over her breast. So there is very little left up to the imagination or for the audience to interpret. We know exactly what is happening. As we move forward, though, in his career, the straightforward appeal and approach to interpretation and to how we understand these scenes becomes more ambiguous, such as works like The Milkmaid of 1658 to 60, whereby we have a woman preparing a child's breakfast, pouring, once again, milk on top of bread to soften it. Here we have womanly virtues relating to humility, modesty, and selfless dedication to others. The foot warmer below and to the right is going to be indicative of her having no companionship whatsoever, so she is available. The Cupid on the wall behind them is going to also reinforce this notion that she needs to fall in love. In the tile directly to the left, the Cupid can be seen with his wings and bow. Now, his early work, as discussed, is going to have rich impasto effects where he builds up the paint on the surface. This can be seen especially with the texture of the bread, which shows how three-dimensional and bumpy it would be. Now, we know that with Vermeer, many people have suggested that he used a camera obscura, such as David Hockney, which is going to be a device that will focus the light in a given area onto a mirror and then flip that upside down so that you can trace whatever it is pointed at. So this makeshift portable tracing table is going to be well known, and all artists of this age had access to this technology. But even if he did have access to it, allowing him to show where the outlines would be in this illusionistic perspectival rendering, he would still need to reconcile the outline with the fall of light and these abstracted areas. The maid, in fact, is not a maid at all, for she wears yellow and blue. These are not what the colors a maid would wear. Instead, they are attributes of pittura or painting from Cesare Ripa's very famous Iconologia, showing allegories from A to Z, from abundance to zeal. So this is an allegory of painting with a double message celebrating the art of painting and the female virtues that are going to be shown here with humility and selfless dedication. So we find that the ideas presented by Vermeer go beyond mere genre scenes or what we're seeing transpiring in a domestic sphere. They instead reinforce proper social and moral behavior that is expected of women, as seen here with Mice's sleeping servant. And we can see that we pare it down even further with the girl with a pearl earring. For now we have the same allegory merely stripped to its essentials, celebrating womanly virtue and the notion that women represent art and painting as ideas and as themes that we've talked about this entire class. In his Woman Reading a Letter at an Open Window of 1658, right after The Milkmaid, we have one of the most common subjects that he will continually paint, that being well-to-do women that are alone. Now, we do not see them in family scenes, and we never show children in Vermeer. Instead, we are distanced from this woman who is reading a letter. We see her reflection in the window that is open. So this theme of letters, that being human encounters that are implied rather than shown, are appropriate for the dense subliminal imagery and messages that Vermeer embeds in his works. So we know that we cannot approach her, and that the human relationship that she is engaged in is going to be implied. The table gets in our way. She ignores us, does not look out at us. She is expressionless. Therefore, we do not know. Is she getting good news? Is it bad news? Is it a letter from her lover or husband? We do not know. And in fact, if you look at the woman, her form, her psychology, and her gesture are all closed to the viewer. She is closed off both physically and emotionally. We cannot access her. Now, what is interesting is we not only have a domestic scene whereby we could see a woman reading a letter inside of a Dutch townhome at this time, but there are additional classical references at play here with the fruit and the curtain. And this references Pliny the Elder's story of Zeuxis and Paracelsus, and these two greatest painters known for their mimetic abilities, competing for the title of the best illusionistic painter in ancient Greece. The story goes, Zeuxis is going to paint fruit that were so lifelike birds tried to eat them, thus he fooled nature. Paracelsus, on the other hand, covers his painting with a curtain. He paints one on, and Zeuxis comes and tries to move the curtain. Thus we find that he has fooled man and is the winner of this contest. So we have the same theme here with a curtain and fruit. But what of course is also interesting is Dutch collectors actually did cover these paintings with said curtains. So you would have this double entendre of a curtain, classical reference, and literal curtain. So this curtain, once again, and fruit can be seen in multiple paintings and referencing these classical traditions. Here's one by Rembrandt, for instance, in the Holy Family. Continuing his theme of upper-class women in interior spaces alone, we have Woman Holding a Balance from 1665. The woman here was never identified, but we do know that Rubens and Van Dyck used their own wives as models, so it is assumed that this could be a portrait of his pregnant wife, given that they had 11 children. She holds a scale and is going to be weighing her jewelry, standing in front of a painting of the Last Judgment, whereas directly in front of her there is a closed window and a mirror. So the scales are going to be empty. She is about to weigh gold and jewels, but not yet, which is important for the interpretation of this scene. The judgment, once again, seen behind her and framing her, is going to await. It has not begun yet for her and the soul that is inside of her, just as she has not yet begun to weigh the scales. But the framing element is significant. For we know that, like the parental admonition by Terborch, the thing behind the main figure is going to inform us of how to interpret the painting. So these framing devices, whereby we have a self-reflection with this mirror, a darkened room turned inward, and then a Last Judgment framing her as she holds scales, is difficult to ignore. Instead, we would see her, given the coloration of her, once again, cloak, this blue cloak with a white veil, makes her look like the Virgin Mary. Thus, she is the intercessor of our souls. We move through her to get to the Last Judgment beyond. Just as with Michelangelo's Last Judgment, which would be very famous and would be well known in the North, we go through the Virgin Mary to gain salvation with Christ, for she is the Mother of God. One of his most enigmatic paintings and largest would be The Art of Painting, which was never sold. So we know it had a personal importance to the artist and his family. For his widow even tried to keep it and avoid the tax collector and the selling off of his estate by giving it to her mother. So at 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, it is the largest domestic scene by the artist and shows a standard northern artist representing all artists in the north, as we have have this elegant black costume with a beret. He is painting this young woman who is dressed as Clio, the muse of history, who wears a laurel wreath and turns back towards the painter in front of this map. We find that the artist's black and white costume has been interpreted as chiaroscuro, or once again light and shade, as part of painting, given that this entire painting is an allegory relating to painting. The curtain at the top again references the Zeuxinian story of fooling the eye, of this mimetic understanding of the discipline. The muse Clio is often shown carrying this horn and carrying a book, showing that she's responsible for inspiring historians. Now, we also can understand this figure as fama, or fame, given that it is modeled on nature and the careful necessity and study of modeling things on nature. Thus, these ideal models are imitatio, the mask on the table, the sketchbook representing disegno, all call attention to the different aspects and elements of painting proper. Here we have fama, or fame, as an example, who also holds a trumpet and often wears a laurel wreath, trumpeting the fame of this particular art. The background shows a map, which is common in Dutch genre scene painting, usually highlighting the wealth from trade and the maritime empire that Holland has. In this instance, though, it's turned on its side, and there is a crease in the center, where we have the schism between the northern Dutch Republic and the southern country of Flanders. So, as a Catholic, does this mean that he longs for unification? Either way, it celebrates this region's accomplishments and Flemish artists going all the way back to Jan van Eyck, and he would count himself among these great artists. The most popular genre by far in Holland would be landscape. Now, landscape is so beloved because of how the Dutch saw their land, for it is newly won. Now, the interest here of the Dutch in this flat land, which is reclaimed much like Noah after the flood, is interestingly not going to be appropriate for landscape as a genre, for the climate is often rainy and rather morose and overcast, and the geography is very flat. It is not interesting. So we know that earlier in this region, landscape painters would produce artificially high viewpoints and these imaginative landscapes that are not going to be associated with reality. And they nearly are always shown in summer instead of the seasons we're more accustomed to now. So Jacob van Ruisdael is going to be the greatest Dutch landscape painter and is known for his versatility and technical brilliance. He produces every category of landscape except for Italianate views, such as those produced by Piranesi and others. Now, born in Haarlem, he trains with his father and then assists his uncle, Solomon van Ruisdael. Now, he is independent in his late teens and is already producing quality work and making a name for himself. He enters the Guild of Painters in Haarlem in 1648, the year of the official Treaty of Munster signing and Holland being recognized as its own country, and then moves and becomes a part of the Guild of Painters in Amsterdam in 1657. Now, here we have the windmill at Wiekby Drusted, which finds itself as, along with the Night Watch, one of the national icons of the Netherlands. It's on money and stamps, for instance. Here we have a windmill and a series of dikes where three girls look on in the mid-ground left, with a ship coming into the harbor and this overcast sky threatening, once again, these figures in this village. With his Jewish cemetery of 1654 to 55, we have an indication of the main themes Ruisdael will popularize and how his approach is going to bring together naturalistic observation with a flair for the dramatic with Baroque landscape. Here we have a cemetery used by Portuguese Jewish communities in Amsterdam. Now, in this painting, we have the tomb shown as a memento mori, with dead trees and ruins, all relating to death and decay. However, we do show hope in the rainbow that is breaking through, as well as the light coming through the clouds. The promise that even though there is death, we have the promise of eternal life. Now, if we compare the painting to photographs of the actual cemetery in Amsterdam, we can see how Ruisdael is going to modify his themes to make them more appealing and dramatic. So what he does here is add these ruins, this stream in the middle, and once again the hilly landscape here, transforming the seemingly ordinary into the extraordinary. For the cemetery itself is quite uninspiring and certainly not as dramatic. In the scene, we find that he carefully places these framing elements off to each side, such as the trees and the brook in the center, much like Poussin had and the Carracci would. But we find instead they are going to not be rational or orderly. We have this baroque landscape, which is not designed for man's will and for us to enter. So looking at the burial of Phocion, for instance, we're going to move through this progressively, plane by plane. There's even a path on which our eye can follow and we can walk. In Ruisdael's example, we are barred from the scene, blocked at the right by a dead tree, at the left by this sarcophagus, and in the center we have this stream with a broken tree, all blocking our access to this scene, which is both threatening and also promises eternal life. With the view of Bentheim Castle of 1653, we have a further example of this type of Baroque landscape. Now, this castle is transformed from a rather flat and unimpressive site to one that is on top of this hill, almost a mountain. The castle is going to survive on the border between the Netherlands and Germany. However, it is not on a hill, and the Dutch Calvinists here would interpret this castle as a metaphor of refuge and divine protection, whereby Psalm 18 states, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer." And so we have what it represents for the Dutch shown, not what it actually looks like. For we have it here elevated up on this high ridge with a windmill as well, which is very important for understanding the Dutch interpretation of God, the soul, and the interaction between the two. So here, Baroque expansiveness is going to be appropriate rather than focusing on a particular motif. Yes, there is a castle, but we can move beyond it to other parts of the scene, such as the clouds above or the windmill in the background. We are drawn to the back in this dramatic diagonal in a foreshortened fashion, quite quickly and dramatically, much like we saw with Rubens' view of Het Steen. As mentioned, Ruisdael's symbolism all relates to the brevity of human life and the natural cycle of birth, life, death, and decay, as seen in nature, reflecting once again our own condition. So instead of showing, like his Mannerist predecessors, landscapes during the summer, he often will show a series relating to the different seasons, like Peter Bruegel the Elder. Here, with his winter landscape with windmill of 1670, we transform the ordinary into the extraordinary based upon the treatment, whereby we have winter scenes associated with old age, melancholy, and death already popularized by Bruegel. We just move further along with this interpretation with Ruisdael, as we have the horizon line being very low instead of a bird's eye view, which was popular in Bruegel's day. The monochromatic color scheme is icy and chilly, as we have the sun barely breaking through the clouds in the background. Now, the association of the different seasons with the elements, planets, and one's age, as well as temperament and, once again, quality, were well documented at this time. So we find that winter is going to be associated with old age, being phlegmatic, the planets Moon and Venus, and the qualities of cold wetness. Therefore, the phlegmatic is going to be a pale complexion, whereby we have all of these overlapping themes that would be understood at the time by a viewer. So in emblem books, importantly, windmills are shown as the embodiment and interdependence of man and God, whereas the windmill itself is powerless without the wind. So man needs God's spiritual guidance. And so we are the windmill. Our soul is the windmill. And God is going to be what drives us, directs us, the wind in this way. So like Poussin, we are elevating landscapes above merely sentimentality and anecdotal treatments. Now they are going to represent something as significant as the cycle of life and death as we know it. Next time we will have our final exam, so please review the study guide, make your flashcards, and have them ready to show me before then.